so excited to talk to you about week 2 as we review the second week of creation to Christ, our walk with the Lord through the Old Testament. Now, just to remind you where we are in the bigger part of the story of the Old Testament, the story of God and his redemptive plan through Jesus Christ, we see that last week we talked about how he created all things. God is the creator of all things. He created Adam and Adam and Eve, they decided to sin against God and disobey his commands, and through their disobedience, sin entered the world, and death was the punishment for sin. We see the tragic depravity of sin and the consequences of sin in chapter 6, where God is grieved because of the sin of man, and he decides to destroy the earth through a flood, but he preserves a remnant in Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and daughters-in-law. And so we see this story of God's preservation and his establishing his first covenant with Noah and the earth. And then we go ahead and we move forward in things, and we meet Abraham, and we see that God pursues Abraham, and he gives him 3 promises: a land, a nation, and that through him would be a blessing to all. Okay, and 25 years go by before Abraham has his promised son of Isaac. We see the story of him being willing to sacrifice his one and only son, pointing us to the God who is willing to sacrifice his one and only son. And Isaac, the willing son, willing to lay down his life to be obedient to his father, foreshadowing Jesus Christ. So Isaac, he grows up, he marries Rebekah. They have 2 twin boys. They are very different, and that is where we pick up today in the story of Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau were very, very different, and God had already established before they were born, or maybe right when they were born, that the older would serve the younger. Okay, so God already established that Jacob would be the one through whom the promises would go to. So we see that this would have come about without the manipulation of human hands. But Rebekah, just like her mother-in-law, could not help it. Couldn't help but manipulate a little things. Isn't that what we all do? Sometimes we think that God needs our help, that his plan will not come to fruition without our maneuvering of things, without our help, or we trust God's plan but not his timing. And so we see that with Sarah, and we see that with Rebekah as well. So that's where we pick up. So Jacob, remember, he's the one who doesn't really like to be outdoors. He is a wonderful cook, and he is cooking red stew meat. And Esau comes in, and he is very dramatic, and he is very, very hungry. He says, listen, he's weary, and he wants to eat this red stew meat. And as a result, Jacob says, he realizes the situation he's in. So he decides to manipulate a little bit in this story. He says, okay, if you give me your birthright, I will give you this stew. And so Esau goes ahead and sacrifices his birthright in this story. Now, as a result, it's interesting, just as a side note, Esau, it has red hair. He sacrificed his birthright for red stew meat. And he settled in a land where there was kind of this red rock and sand. And as a result, his descendants are called the Edomites, which Edom literally means red. So just kind of put that in the back of your mind. His descendants are the Edomites. They will be coming back. We will see them again, okay? So here we see Jacob taking advantage of his brother's desperation. Now, what is a birthright? A birthright is something given to the firstborn. It is a double portion of inheritance. It's something that you get. You get double part of your father's inheritance. You also are the leader. You also are the leader of your house. You kind of replace your father in being the patriarchal figure of your home. So Esau, he sold it, he ate, he drank, and he walked away. Now, we know that God already established Jacob would be the one to whom the promises would be fulfilled through. So God's established purpose would have happened with or without Jacob manipulating his brother. And on the outside, it seems like Jacob is so manipulative and Esau is an innocent bystander. But I want to shed some light on this because in Hebrews 12:16-17, it says, "See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he saw the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done." We see that he does this in our second story this week that we're going to talk about today. But what we see is that Esau, he failed to recognize the significance of the spiritual blessings and promises of God and sold it to get immediate gratification of his physical needs. Okay? I'm going to say it again. He failed to recognize and see the significance of spiritual blessings and sacrifice them to gain physical needs or get his physical desires satisfied. Immediate gratification. He was godless. He didn't believe in the promises of God. And so what we see is time goes on. This happened. Time moves on. Isaac, he thinks he's about to die. He doesn't end up dying right away, but nonetheless, he's ready to give his blessing. Now, the blessing and the birthright are synonymous. They are the same. So what do we see here is that Isaac is trying to manipulate things to get Esau back his birthright, okay? So he says, "Go ahead, Esau, I'm going to give you your blessing." And Rebekah, she takes advantage of this and she manipulates things, and Jacob ends up covering himself with some hair and he gets the blessing. Okay? And although that's what Hebrews is talking about, that Esau tried, he realized it too late. It was already given up. And Jacob got the blessing, he got the birthright. And so, Esau was mad. He was real mad. And so he was ready to kill his brother. Rebekah knew that. So she sends Jacob to her brother Laban, okay? So now Jacob's working for Laban and he sees Laban's daughters. Yes, they are his cousins. So just so you know, but he ends up seeing a beautiful woman named Rachel. And he says, "I love Rachel so much, I want to marry her." And so he ends up working for Laban for 7 years. And what he thinks is Rachel, where he thinks he is marrying Rachel, he ends up marrying her older sister, Leah. So Rachel was beautiful. Leah, I'm sure, had a great personality. And Laban says, "Listen, Jacob is mad. The manipulator gets manipulated," by Uncle Laban. It's probably where Rebekah learned it from her brother. Nonetheless, they are a family of manipulators, and Jacob gets manipulated. And so he marries Leah, who has a great personality. He's not too thrilled. He goes back to Uncle Laban and says, "Listen, I want Rachel." So Laban says, "Okay, no problem. Marry Rachel, and then you can work another 7 years for me." And so he goes ahead. Now he has 2 wives. Okay? And it says that Leah is unloved. Now that is not meaning she was loved less. Like he loved Rachel and he loved Leah some, but not as much as Rachel. No. The way that that's translated is he hated Leah. He hated her. But see, what do we see is that once again, God sees the people who are despised. God, just like God saw Hagar, who was a pawn in the manipulation of God's promises and plan by Sarah, we see that God sees Leah, who is a pawn in the manipulation of Laban, of her father. God sees the people who are hurt by other people's sin. He sees those who are unloved or hated. And he sees Leah, And he sees her, and so he allows her to have many children. She has son after son, and after each one, what does she do? She hopes, this will be the son that makes my husband love me. But after each one, Jacob still does not love Leah. So Leah ends up having her fourth son, who is Judah. And she says, now I will praise the Lord. See, she kept trying to get her husband's approval and her husband's love with each son. And every time it's unsuccessful, she doesn't get the love she so yearns for. And so finally she has Judah, and she goes to the God who loves her, and she's satisfied with God and rejoices in the Lord. I just love the story of Leah's heart. And so she has Judah, and Rachel is once again barren. We see Sarah barren. We see Rebecca was barren until, I should say, God miraculously allowed them to get pregnant. Rachel is also barren. We see that this was something that God used in the life of these women. He closed their womb for a reason, for his purposes. And so Rachel is barren. And finally, what we see is that God remembers Rachel. Now, it doesn't mean that God forget. Just like when you read the account of Noah, it says that God remembered Noah when he was on the ark. It does not mean that God forgets. He didn't forget about Rachel. But what that Hebrew word means is it means to be moved to action. It's being moved to act in a way and to do something about it. And so he remembers Rachel. He is moved to action. He listens to her. There is great comfort in knowing that we serve a God who listens to us, right? Who sees us, who hears our prayers, and who is moved to act on our behalf. Okay, so he hears her prayers, and she ends up having a son, Joseph. Now, Jacob has 12 different sons, okay, who become the 12 tribes of Israel. But Joseph is his overt favorite. His parents had favorites. He has favorites. He has a favorite wife. He has a favorite son, who is Rachel's first boy, Joseph, okay? So he loves him so much, he gives him this coat of many colors. Joseph knows he is loved and favored by his father. He probably hoards it over his brother's head a little bit. We see Joseph also has these dreams of his brothers bowing down before him. So his brothers really hate him. They really don't like Joseph. And his father, Jacob, sends Joseph to go check on his brothers. And now we see that their hatred of him forms a plot to get Joseph. And there's two brothers in this scheme that are highlighted. One is Reuben. Reuben is the oldest son. He decides that he does not want Joseph to die, so his plan was to pull him out of the pit that they put him in. And then another son, Judah, who is highlighted as well, and he is the one who sells Joseph into slavery. So Joseph ends up being sold to the Ishmaelites or the Midianites. The Midianites are descendants of Ishmael, who is their great uncle. So these people are second cousins to them, but it does not matter. Joseph gets sold to them, and he ends up in Egypt, where he has a series of unfortunate events. He ends up he's in slavery. He gets promoted only to be falsely accused of sexual immorality. So he gets thrown into prison only to be favored and interpret dreams correctly, only to be forgotten by his friends. And see, what we see is it seems as if God is far from Joseph over these series of unfortunate events in Joseph's life. Sometimes it feels when we go through hard times, and we see that God is silent. It feels like God is silent in our trials and our hard times. What we see with Joseph, though, is that God's silence is not indicative of his abandonment. Just because we have adversity in our life, it does not mean that God has abandoned us. Because what do we see in Genesis chapter 39? We see that 3 times it says that God was with Joseph. God didn't leave Joseph. He reassures him of his presence. Now, whether Joseph knew this or not, we don't know. But what we do know is that in Joseph's trials, his faith was strengthened. We see he did not abandon his faith and belief in God. We see him giving God credit when Joseph interprets dreams. He doesn't take the credit for it. He gives it to the Lord. And when there is a resolution of his trials, there is forgiveness, there is grace, recognizing God's provision and his sovereignty over all. Okay, but that's jumping ahead. So here we are. He is in prison. And 2 of his fellow prisoners have dreams, and both of these dreams come true. One dies and one gets promoted. And Joseph says, listen, when you are back promoted as the cupbearer to the king, please remember me. But he forgets him. He forgets him. And so 2 whole years go by, and Pharaoh ends up having 2 different dreams that no one can interpret. And finally, Joseph is remembered by the cupbearer and how he can interpret dreams. So Joseph is called, and he goes to Pharaoh, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. He says, listen, this is going to happen. You have 2 dreams, because God is saying this will happen no matter what. And so there's going to be 7 full years of plenty of food. And then that is followed by 7 years of famine. So he says, listen, put someone wise in charge so that they can hold the food and we will be just fine during our famine. And Pharaoh, he appreciates this. He says, okay, that sounds like a good plan to me. And he puts Joseph in charge. Joseph is second in command before Pharaoh. He is given a high rank. And he's in charge of the food. He's in charge of storing the food. He puts together a portion of the food every year so that they have plenty during the famine. Joseph also marries 2 women. He has 2 different, he marries a woman that Pharaoh gives him. He has 2 sons. He has Manasseh and he has Ephraim. Manasseh, Joseph says, for God has made me forget all of my father's house. And Ephraim, where Joseph says, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. He sees that. We see that God is still present in Joseph's life, and Joseph's faith is still strong. So the famine comes, and we see that Joseph's original dream comes true. His brothers come because they have a famine and they are in need of food, and they come, and what do? They bow down before Joseph. And his dream comes true. Now, at this point in the story, it has been about 20 years since they have seen each other. It has been a long time, and his brothers do not recognize Joseph. Certainly, they would never have imagined Joseph being in this position. They sold him to slavery. To them, he was as good as dead. And you know what they did? They told their father that lie. And sometimes when you tell a lie long enough, you start to believe it yourself, don't you? So they see this, and what happens is Joseph accuses them of lying, and he does a lot of weird things. He ends up, it seems like Joseph might be playing games with his brothers, right? He throws some in prison. He demands they go get Benjamin. He puts a cup in someone's sack, gives them money, but accuses them of stealing, like all of these different things. It's like, what is Joseph doing? Did he lose his mind? But here what we see is that Joseph was testing his brothers. Did they really change? Or were they the same as they were before? Did they feel bad about what they did? Do they really feel, bad for what they did to Joseph? And here from Joseph, we glean an important lesson. See, he serves as an example for us. When we are wronged, we are to entrust ourselves to the one who judges justly, just as Christ also did. This is from 1 Peter chapter 2. But we don't necessarily need to trust the ones who have wronged us. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to trust the people who have wronged us. It was wise for Joseph to see if his brothers had changed, or did they still hate Joseph? So now they feel very guilty over what they did. They feel like this is what they deserve. This is what they get for what they did to Joseph. And so Reuben, he tries to justify himself like, I was going to just put him back. There's all of this bickering and fighting. And Joseph, he understands all that they are saying. He's so moved. He removes himself and he weeps. And he realizes their hearts were changed. They so felt bad about what they did. And they see, rather than putting Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob's only other son, from Rachel, we see that rather than putting him in harm's way, they protect him. They didn't treat him the way that they treated Joseph. No, they protected him as older brothers ought to. And so Joseph sees their change in heart, and one brother in particular is starting to rise to the occasion and be highlighted. Now, we didn't read it, but I kind of want to go over a little bit about Judah's story because we see a lot of negative things about Judah. But he is the one chosen to whom the Messiah will come through, his line. So God chooses Judah. God always chooses those that we would never choose. Like if we look at things, we would have chosen Joseph for so many years. I was like, why did God choose Judah and not Joseph? Well, I want to show you a little bit about Judah. See, he had two sons, and he had a son who was married to Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Tamar ended up being a widow when Judah's son died, and Judah's other son failed to do the thing he should have done and married Tamar. Judah never forced him to do that, and so Tamar, recognizing she was not taken care of, she was not treated rightly, she ends up tricking Judah, and she poses herself as a prostitute, comes before Judah. Judah ends up sleeping with her. She gets pregnant. A lot of crazy things. Now, what's interesting, though, is Judah ends up saying, you are more righteous than I. When he recognizes that she is Tamar and he's the one that she slept with, he doesn't cover his sin. He exposes it and he repents of it. And in his repentance, he says, Tamar is more righteous than I am. And the reason he says that is because Tamar recognized the importance and the significance of continuing the line in their family, because she saw the significance of the spiritual promises that God said would happen through this chosen family. And it was important to keep the line. And she recognized that. And so that's why Judah says, you are more righteous than I. She was concerned with preserving the line of the Messiah. And this all led to Jacob's blessing and his pointing to the fact that Judah would be the one through whom the Messiah comes. Okay, so the brothers end up showing this testimony of true repentance. Joseph sees that, he weeps and he cries, and he reveals himself to his brothers, and he shows us a beautiful example of forgiveness and grace and redemption. A desire for their best, not lording things over them, not rubbing things in their face, but in an unhindered, complete forgiveness and grace and a true restoration of the fellowship of these brothers. And so we see that Joseph provides that example of what true forgiveness looks like for us. He ends up encouraging everyone, please come back to Egypt where they will be preserved. Now, what do we see this week? Some major themes that we see this week. One, we see a lot of manipulation continuing on regarding the promises of God. We see that as Sarah manipulated things and then Ishmael was born, we see Rebekah and Isaac manipulating the blessings to try to bless their favorite son. We see Jacob manipulating his brother. Laban manipulates Jacob. And Joseph's brothers manipulate against and conspire against him. We see this overt favoritism theme that continues to rise to the surface of Isaac and Rebekah having their favorite twin. We see Jacob then having his favorite wife and therefore his favorite sons. But we also see that even in the sins of manipulation and favoritism, we see that God's plans are firmly established. There is nothing that can thwart God's established purposes and plans and promises. See, Isaac is still the chosen son. We see that Jacob is still the one to whom the blessing would come to. We see that even though wombs are closed, God is the one who will determine when they are opened. We see that although people try to kill, Joseph's brothers try to kill him, God preserves. We see that when Joseph gets falsely accused, God doesn't forget about him. We see that although the famine threatened to destroy the family of God, God provides his preservation for his people. And I love the way we see that God's promises are firm, that his provision is sure. And we see that God's plan cannot be thwarted. So I hope that serves and that shows you more about who God is. We start to continue to see these themes. And as we go over things next week, we're going to continue to see more themes emerge, more understanding of who God is as we continue to read our story from creation to Christ in the Old Testament. I'm excited to talk to you about it, and I'll see you next week.